All right, Army, lean in close, because what you're about to discover isn't just gossip. It's the silent language 7 men have been speaking for over a decade without you even realizing it. Every tilt of the head, every hand hidden in a pocket, every microsecond of hesitation before a smile, it all means something. Have you ever wondered why one member always turns his body away from cameras before he laughs for real? Or why another can't stop touching his own collar when nervous? Buckle up, because number 7 is about to change how you watch every fan cam ever again. Number 7. Jungkook, the hand that hides everything, the golden maknae's silent truth. Picture this, stage lights blazing, thousands screaming his name, and there he stands, spinning a vocal run so clean it sounds edited, throwing that signature smirk like it costs him nothing. That's the Jungkook the world sees. But rewind the footage, slow it down frame by frame, and something strange starts happening the moment the camera catches him off guard. In the in-between seconds nobody's supposed to be watching, his hand goes straight to his mouth. Not dramatically, not obviously, just a quick, almost reflexive cover, fingers brushing his lips or his nose, sometimes disguised as scratching an itch, sometimes disguised as fixing his mask, sometimes just left hanging there like he forgot to put it down. Body language experts call this a classic self-soothing barrier gesture, something humans do subconsciously when they feel a flash of vulnerability they don't want anyone to witness. And here's the wild part. Jungkook does this constantly, in interviews, in Run BTS episodes, in Bangtan bombs, in the split second right after he says something a little too honest or a little too soft. Think about it. This is a man who debuted at 15 years old, thrown into a system where every single movement, every blink, every breath was trained, filmed, critiqued, and repeated until it became muscle memory. By the time global fame hit, and it hit like a tidal wave, Jungkook had already spent almost half his life learning how to control his face for cameras. His expressions during performances are engineered confidence, drilled through thousands of hours of choreography and vocal lessons. But hands? Hands are harder to train. Hands leak truth. And that's exactly why whenever an interviewer asks something a little too personal about loneliness, about pressure, about missing his 20s like a normal 20-something would get to live it, you'll catch that hand rising almost instinctively, shielding the lower half of his face, like a shy teenager caught off guard, even though the man underneath has sold out stadiums on 5 continents. Fans have clipped this moment 1,000 times without realizing what they were actually capturing. Remember the Run BTS episode where he got quietly emotional, talking about how much he missed simple things, like walking outside without being recognized? Watch his hands in that clip. They don't stay still for a second. They touch his collar, then his nose, then retreat into his sleeve. Like his body was trying to build a wall his words weren't allowed to admit needed building. Then there's the sniffing, a small, repetitive nose touch that psychologists link directly to anxiety regulation, an unconscious attempt to release tension through a physical action when the emotional one isn't safe to show. Jungkook does this so often during Weverse lives that ARMY jokingly nicknamed him the sniffling maknae, treating it like a cute quirk, when in reality it's one of the clearest windows into how much invisible pressure this man is carrying every single day of his life. Here's the emotional gut punch though. This isn't a flaw, this is survival. Growing up as the youngest in a group of 6 older brothers, thrust into an industry that demands perfection with zero room for public vulnerability, Jungkook built these tiny physical habits as a private release valve, a way to process emotion without ever fully breaking character in front of millions of eyes. It's the same reason he became famous for burying his face into a hoodie, or turning his back briefly after finishing an emotional vocal line, or grabbing the nearest member's arm and holding on a beat too long. These aren't just cute maknae things like casual fans assume. They're documented psychological patterns of someone regulating overwhelming emotion in real time, on camera, without ever letting the mask fully slip. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. Compare interview Jungkook to stage Jungkook. On stage, his shoulders drop back, his chin lifts, his gaze burns directly into the camera lens like he owns the entire arena. That's dominant, confident body language, the kind performers train for years to master. But strip away the stage, put him in a quiet room with a single microphone and a personal question, and that confident posture folds inward, shoulders curling slightly, hand rising to the mouth, eyes flicking sideways before answering. It's the difference between performed identity and authentic self, and Jungkook's body language is basically a live diagram of the emotional labor idols perform daily without anyone clocking it. So next time you watch a Jungkook interview clip, don't just listen to his words, track his hands, watch when they rise, watch what question triggered it, because, Army, that split-second gesture is Jungkook's most honest sentence, spoken in a language louder than any lyric he's ever recorded, and it's been hiding in plain sight this entire time. The question is, now that you know what to look for, are you ready to see just how deep this pattern goes with the next member on this list? Because number 7 was subtle, number 6 is about to be impossible to unsee. Number 6. Jimin, the shoulder that curls inward, beauty behind the bashful wall. Now, here's where things get emotionally layered, Army, because Jimin's body language operates on a completely different frequency than Jungkook's, and once you see it, you'll realize you've been mislabeling one of his consistent habits as just shyness for years. Watch any candid clip of Jimin the moment a camera swings toward him unexpectedly, especially during interviews where he's not the one currently speaking. His shoulder, usually the left one, rises slightly and curls inward, almost like he's trying to make himself physically smaller while his chin dips down and his eyes flick sideways rather than meeting the lens directly. Casual viewers call this cute, charming, the classic shy Jimin trope that's been repeated in fan edits for a decade. But body language specialists recognize this as a defensive contraction, a physical response humans display when they feel suddenly exposed or self-conscious, an instinctive attempt to protect the torso, which is the most vulnerable part of the human body, from perceived scrutiny. And here's what makes it so fascinating with Jimin specifically. This isn't random. It shows up almost exclusively in moments involving praise, compliments, or attention directed solely at him. Watch him get complimented on his dancing, his vocals, his visuals, anything that puts a spotlight purely on Jimin as an individual rather than Jimin as part of the group. And that shoulder curls, that chin drops, sometimes his hand rises to cover half his face while he laughs it off with a bashful "Anya, Anya." Think about the psychological roots here. Jimin has spoken publicly more than once about struggling with self-confidence early in his trainee years, about feeling like he had to work twice as hard as members who seemed naturally gifted, about genuinely doubting whether he deserved his spot in the group during the brutal trainee elimination system that could cut anyone at any time. That internalized insecurity doesn't just disappear the moment someone debuts and becomes famous. It lives in the body long after the mind has logically accepted success. So when someone showers him with individual praise, his body still reacts with that old defensive posture, shoulder curling protectively, like a decade-old habit refusing to fully unlearn itself, even now that he's an internationally recognized artist with solo chart-topping records. But here's the plot twist that flips the entire narrative. Put Jimin on stage, mid-performance, executing choreography, and that same body transforms entirely. Spine elongates, chest opens, shoulders pull back and down in that classic dancer's posture, chin lifts with unshakable confidence, and his eye contact with the camera becomes laser-focused, intentional, almost predatory in its intensity. This isn't contradiction, it's compartmentalization, a psychological survival mechanism performers develop where the on-stage self operates under completely different rules than the off-stage self. dance for Jimin isn't just skill. Multiple interviews reveal it as literally the medium through which he found his voice when he felt he had none, growing up as a quieter, more introverted kid before joining a company that saw potential in his movement before anyone saw it in his personality. That's why his body speaks fluent confidence in choreography, but stutters into bashfulness the instant the context shifts to personal, unstructured, off-script attention. Now here's a detail hardcore ARMY will recognize instantly once it's pointed out: the hair touch. Watch Jimin during slightly awkward silences, transitional moments in variety shows, or right after he said something he immediately feels embarrassed about. His hand goes straight to his hair, a light touch, sometimes just brushing it back, sometimes fully running fingers through it. This is a globally recognized self-soothing gesture, an unconscious attempt to release tension through repetitive physical touch, the same reason people bite nails or twirl pens when anxious. Jimin's version is softer, more subtle, but it's there in nearly every uncomfortable pause across a decade of footage. And then there's the laugh cover, arguably his most iconic tell. When something genuinely catches him off guard and he laughs authentically, unguarded, his hand shoots up to cover his mouth almost every single time, sometimes his entire face disappearing behind both palms. On the surface, ARMY calls this endearing. Underneath, it's actually a documented behavior linked to feeling emotionally exposed during genuine, uncontrolled reactions, because a real laugh means a real loss of composure. And even after all these years of fame, part of Jimin still instinctively wants to shield that raw, unguarded version of himself from public view, even while surrounded by people who've watched him grow up on camera. It's a beautiful contradiction, isn't it? A man capable of commanding an entire stadium with a single graceful movement, yet still physically flinching from a compliment directed at him personally. That's the emotional core of Jimin's body language. Brilliance built directly on top of unhealed insecurity. Confidence performed so masterfully it convinces everyone, except, apparently, his own shoulders. So keep this in mind next time you watch him receive praise during a Weverse live or an interview. Track that shoulder, track that chin, and ask yourself how many years of internal battle it takes to still physically flinch from kindness, even after becoming one of the most celebrated performers on the planet. Because ARMY, number 6 revealed the war between confidence and self-doubt living inside one body, but number 5 is about to expose something even more heartbreaking, hiding behind a completely different kind of smile. Number 5, V. The eyes that look away first. Taehyung's silent storm behind the smile. Alright, ARMY, this one is going to hit differently because V's body language operates almost like a puzzle wrapped inside a paradox, and once you notice the pattern, you'll never watch his interviews the same way again. Here's the thing about Taehyung that separates him from every other member on this list. His default expression, the one paparazzi and stage cameras catch most often, is intense, brooding, almost unreadable, that famous boxy smile flipping instantly into a deep, unreadable stillness the second the camera moves. Fans call it 4D, call it mysterious, call it art boy energy. But watch closely during unscripted moments, especially one-on-one interview segments where he's asked something emotionally direct, and you'll catch something specific. His eyes break contact first, drifting downward and to the side, not nervously like Jimin's sidewise grants, but slower, heavier, almost like he's retreating inward to somewhere private before he answers. Body language researchers identify this pattern as a processing gaze aversion, a behavior common in people who experience emotions with unusual depth and need physical distance from direct eye contact to organize internal thoughts before speaking them aloud. And Taehyung has talked openly in multiple interviews and through his own music under his solo persona about feeling emotions extremely intensely, about struggling with loneliness even while surrounded by thousands of screaming fans, about missing his grandmother, who essentially raised him and passed away before he could fully process the grief while balancing a schedule that doesn't pause for mourning. That kind of emotional weight doesn't just vanish, it lives in the body, and for Taehyung, it lives specifically in his eyes and his stillness. Watch him during quieter moments in Run BTS or In the Soup, and you'll notice something nobody talks about. His hands go completely still, not relaxed still, but deliberately, unnaturally still, folded together or resting flat against his lap, like he's consciously holding himself in place. Psychologists link this kind of controlled stillness to emotional restraint, an unconscious method of preventing the body from revealing feelings the person isn't ready to verbalize. Compare this to Jungkook's fidgeting hands or Jimin's curling shoulders. Taehyung's tell isn't movement, it's the absence of movement, a frozen quality that appears specifically when conversations turn toward loss, loneliness, or his private inner world. Then there's the head tilt down, then smile sequence, something ARMY has affectionately clipped 1,000 times without realizing its deeper function. Watch him get asked something slightly too personal or slightly too complimentary, and his head tilts downward first, chin dropping toward his chest for a beat, before he lifts his face back up wearing his signature boxy grin, as if the smile was constructed during that brief downward pause rather than arriving naturally. This delayed smile pattern is a documented technique people use, often unconsciously, to buy themselves a half-second of privacy to manage an emotional reaction before presenting a socially acceptable expression to the world. It's not fake exactly, Taehyung's joy is real, but the path to displaying it publicly requires this tiny hidden detour through vulnerability first. And here's where the story turns genuinely emotional. Taehyung has spoken about growing up in a household where money was tight, about sharing responsibility for his younger siblings from a young age, about carrying an old soul heaviness that shaped him long before BTS. That early exposure to responsibility and hardship built a personality that feels everything deeply, but has learned through necessity to process it privately first. On stage, that same intensity transforms into magnetic stage presence. The reason his solo stages, his fashion campaigns, his facial expressions during ballad performances hit fans so hard emotionally, because the depth is genuine, not performed. But that same depth means offstage, unscripted vulnerability requires a visible pause, a breaking of eye contact, a moment of stillness before Taehyung lets the world back in. There's also his voice. Watch how it drops noticeably in pitch and volume during emotionally loaded answers, almost retreating into itself, a vocal mirror of the physical withdrawal happening simultaneously in his posture. Combine the eye aversion, the frozen stillness, the delayed smile, and the quieting voice, and you get a complete physiological portrait of a man who feels too much to perform vulnerability instantly, who needs that half-second of internal retreat before he can hand his real emotion to millions of watching eyes. It's haunting once you see it, isn't it? Because underneath the mystery boy aesthetic that made him a global fashion icon and one of the most photographed faces in the world, there's a genuinely tender, easily wounded person doing quiet, private battle with his own emotional intensity in real time, every single time a camera catches him off guard. So, next time you watch a V interview clip, don't just enjoy the boxy smile. Track what happened right before it. Track the pause, the downward tilt, the stillness in his hands. Because ARMY, that hidden half-second is Taehyung's most vulnerable confession, and it's been broadcast to the world 1,000 times without anyone reading the subtitles. Now brace yourself, because number 4 belongs to the leader, and what his body does under pressure might be the most quietly devastating discovery on this entire list.
Number 4. The hands that vanish into pockets. The leader's hidden weight.
Okay, Army, brace yourselves, because this one carries a different kind of emotional gravity. The weight of leadership itself, worn silently in a body that spent over a decade being watched as the face who answers for everyone. Watch any press conference, any award show interview, any moment where a hard question lands on the group as a whole, and observe where RM's hands go, straight into his pockets, or clasped tightly behind his back, or folded rigidly in his lap, rarely loose, rarely relaxed. Casual fans read this as simple composure, the calm demeanor of the leader, but body language analysts recognize pocket hiding and hand clasping as classic self-restraint gestures, physical behaviors people adopt specifically to suppress visible nervousness or prevent themselves from fidgeting under scrutiny. And think about what RM has actually carried since debut. At just 19 years old, he was handed the label leader of a group that would eventually become one of the biggest cultural forces on Earth, meaning every controversy, every mistranslated quote, every award show speech, every UN address, every diplomatic answer to a politically loaded question fell primarily on his shoulders to navigate in real time, often in his second language, in front of a global audience ready to dissect every syllable. That is an extraordinary, almost unfathomable amount of pressure for someone barely out of his teens, and his body has been quietly absorbing that pressure through restraint ever since. Watch closely, and you'll notice RM rarely uses expansive hand gestures during serious interviews. His movements stay close to his body, controlled, minimal, almost economical, like someone who learned early that every gesture could be screenshotted, analyzed, and turned into a headline, so the safest gesture became no gesture at all. Compare this to his behavior during lighter content, Run BTS, casual vlogs, moments with just the members and no international press watching, and suddenly his hands loosen, gestures widen, he laughs with his whole body, slouches comfortably, becomes visibly, physically younger. That contrast is the whole story right there. RM's body language is essentially a real-time barometer of perceived audience risk, tightening under formal scrutiny and loosening completely the moment he feels safe. There's also the jaw. Watch him during genuinely difficult questions, ones involving criticism of the group, controversy, or requests to comment on politically sensitive topics, and you'll see his jaw set slightly, a subtle tightening around the mouth right before he answers, the physical signature of someone carefully choosing words under pressure, mentally drafting and discarding sentences before allowing any to leave his mouth. This makes complete sense once you remember RM has openly discussed struggling with anxiety and depression, has spoken candidly in interviews, and even in his own solo lyrics about feeling suffocated by the expectation of being articulate, wise, and perfectly composed at every single public appearance, essentially becoming an accidental spokesperson for an entire generation while still privately wrestling with his own mental health. That's an enormous, largely invisible burden, and his tightened jaw before serious answers is the physical residue of a mind working overtime to protect himself and the 6 people standing beside him. Then there's his eye contact pattern, unusually steady, almost deliberately maintained during interviews, rarely breaking away even during uncomfortable questions. While this reads as confidence to most viewers, prolonged, forced eye contact under stress is actually a well-documented compensatory behavior, something people consciously do to project control precisely because they're aware how much scrutiny they're under, essentially performing composure as a protective shield. Think about the sheer psychological labor required to maintain that steady gaze while simultaneously monitoring your own words for translation accuracy, political sensitivity, and impact on your groupmate's public image, all happening in the span of a few seconds per answer. And here's a detail true ARMY veterans will recognize instantly: RM's shoulders. Watch them during group photos, especially older ones from earlier eras, and you'll notice they sit slightly forward, slightly rounded, not from poor posture, but from what appears to be an unconscious protective stance, subtly positioning his body between the camera and quieter members standing beside him, a physical manifestation of leadership responsibility he probably isn't even aware he's performing. It's leadership written directly into posture, years of instinctively shielding, deflecting, and absorbing pressure so it lands on him first rather than the group. This is the quiet tragedy and quiet heroism of RM's body language. A person whose most consistent physical habit is essentially built entirely around protecting others, restraining himself, and projecting calm precisely because the alternative could destabilize everyone counting on him. So next time you watch RM field a difficult question at a press conference, don't just listen to his articulate answer. Watch his hands disappear into his pockets first. Watch that jaw tighten for half a second, and understand that you're witnessing over a decade of accumulated responsibility being physically restrained in real time. Because ARMY, number 4 revealed what leadership actually costs the body, and number 3 is about to show you the exact opposite, someone whose body reveals joy so honestly, it might just break your heart in a completely different way.
Number 3. Jin, the laugh that comes before the words. Seokjin's armor made of sunshine. Alright, ARMY, exactly as promised, this one flips the emotional tone completely, because Jin's body language tells a story of joy used as genuine survival armor, and the mechanics behind it are more fascinating than most fans ever stop to analyze. Watch any interview, any live broadcast, any moment where tension starts building in the room, and observe what Jin does almost instantly. He laughs, loud, unfiltered, often before anyone's even finished a sentence, sometimes at his own jokes a half second before the punchline even lands. Casual viewers call this classic worldwide handsome charm, the classic self-proclaimed comedic relief of the group. But body language specialists recognize early preemptive laughter as a well-documented tension diffusion technique, something people instinctively deploy to control the emotional temperature of a room before discomfort has a chance to settle in. And here's what makes this pattern so specifically Jin. He almost always does this the instant a question veers towards something potentially awkward, whether it's teasing between members, a slightly critical interview question, or simply an uncomfortable silence stretching a beat too long. His laugh arrives like a release valve, not just for himself, but for everyone around him, actively managing the emotional atmosphere of the entire group in real time. Think about his position within BTS, the eldest member, someone who has spoken candidly about feeling responsible for keeping morale up among younger members during grueling schedules, brutal trainee years, and the isolating pressures of fame that hit especially hard for members barely out of adolescence when they debuted. Jin has openly discussed in interviews how he consciously decided early on to become the group's source of comic relief, recognizing that 6 young men under immense pressure needed someone actively working to keep the mood light, and his body language shows the physical fingerprint of that self-appointed role executed thousands of times over a decade. Watch his hands during his signature jokes. They move expansively, dramatically, almost theatrically, full arm gestures, exaggerated facial expressions, completely uninhibited physical comedy that requires genuine confidence and zero self-consciousness to pull off convincingly on camera. This is strikingly different from Jimin's contained shyness or RM's restrained composure. Jin's body takes up space intentionally, commands attention through sheer physical exuberance, because that's precisely the point, redirecting focus away from tension and squarely onto himself. But here's the layer most fans miss entirely. Watch what happens in the split second immediately after his own joke lands, right after the laughter dies down and the camera lingers a moment too long. There's a flicker, barely visible, where his eyes dart briefly toward the other members, checking, almost like he's confirming the mood actually lifted, that his intervention worked, before his expression resets into that easy, confident smile. This micro-check is a subtle but consistent behavior linked to caretaking personalities, people who instinctively monitor group emotional states even while performing for an external audience, essentially running two simultaneous social operations at once, entertaining the public while quietly managing his members' well-being. Then there's his laughter itself, specifically the sound and duration. Jin's laugh often extends slightly longer than the joke itself warrants, a subtle overextension body language experts associate with consciously prolonging positive emotional signals to fully stabilize a room's mood before allowing silence to return. Consider also his military service era interviews, during which fans noticed his humor remained remarkably consistent even while discussing genuinely difficult topics like separation from members, adjusting to military life, and missing performing, his laughter serving as an anchor of continuity, a signal to worried fans that despite circumstances changing dramatically, his core personality and their emotional safety net remained intact. Then there's a specific physical habit true Army veterans have caught repeatedly. Jin frequently reaches out to physically touch nearby members during group interviews, a shoulder pat, an arm around the back, a hand placed briefly on someone's knee, especially during moments when a younger member seems visibly nervous or uncomfortable answering something. This is a textbook reassurance gesture, physical touch deployed specifically to communicate silent support without interrupting the conversation verbally, something eldest siblings in large families often develop instinctively, and Jin has spoken about his close relationship with his own younger family members long before debut. Combine the preemptive laughter, the expansive physical comedy, the post-joke emotional check-ins, the extended laugh duration, and the reassuring touch, and you get a complete behavioral portrait of someone who has quietly assigned himself the role of emotional shock absorber for an entire group, using humor not as deflection from his own feelings, but as active, ongoing labor performed on behalf of everyone around him. It's beautiful and slightly heartbreaking simultaneously, isn't it? Because underneath the effortless charisma that made worldwide handsome a global catchphrase, there's a person whose comedic timing is actually finely tuned emotional caretaking, deployed instinctively and unconsciously for over a decade to protect people he loves. So next time you watch Jin crack a joke seemingly out of nowhere, don't just laugh along. Notice what happened right before it. Notice the tension that existed a half-second earlier, and understand you just watched a silent act of care disguised perfectly as comedy. Because Army number 3 revealed humor as sacrifice, and number 2 is about to show you something even wilder, a body that literally cannot stay still when joy takes over completely.
Number 2, J-Hope, the body that can't stop moving. Hoseok's joy as a physical language. All right, Army, get ready because this one is pure kinetic energy translated into raw emotional honesty. And once you understand the psychology behind it, you'll never underestimate J-Hope's constant motion as just being hyper again. Watch any candid footage, any backstage clip, any moment where genuine happiness hits him, and observe what happens to his entire body. He can't stay still. Feet start moving, hips shift, shoulders bounce, hands find rhythm in the air. Sometimes he'll break into an actual dance sequence in the middle of an interview simply because a good beat played somewhere in the background. Casual fans call this sunshine energy, the group's self-proclaimed hope, and honestly, that's not wrong. But body language researchers identify this constant micro-movement pattern as something deeper, a phenomenon called kinesthetic emotional expression, where certain people process and release joy specifically through physical motion rather than verbal or facial expression alone. For J-Hope, movement isn't decoration on top of his personality. It's practically his native emotional language, the primary channel through which internal feeling becomes externally visible. Think about his background for a moment. Before joining BTS, Hoseok trained seriously in street dance, specifically popping and locking, competing and performing years before trainee life even began, meaning his relationship with movement was established as literal self-expression long before choreography became his job. That early foundation means his body developed a habit most people never build, translating emotional states directly into physical rhythm as naturally as most people translate emotion into words. Watch him during genuinely happy moments versus performed happy moments, and the difference becomes obvious once you know what to look for. Performed positivity, the kind delivered during scripted segments or promotional content, involves controlled, camera-aware movement, precise and contained. But genuine, unguarded joy triggers something looser, more chaotic, movements that don't quite match any choreography, feet shuffling to rhythms only he seems to hear, a kind of physical overflow that looks almost involuntary, because psychologically speaking, it essentially is. This is also where J-Hope's well-documented struggles become relevant. He's spoken candidly, more than most idols ever do, about battling anxiety, about experiencing genuine self-doubt during trainee years, when he almost left the company entirely before an important conversation kept him in the industry, about grappling with imposter syndrome even after achieving massive individual success as a rapper, producer, and eventually solo artist. Someone who has publicly wrestled that intensely with internal anxiety, developing an external outlet this physically expressive, isn't coincidental. Movement became his primary regulation tool, a way to physically metabolize difficult emotions long before he had language or confidence to discuss them verbally. Watch specifically what happens when interviewers ask him something that touches on his earlier struggles or insecurities. There's frequently a brief pause where his body goes almost still, uncharacteristically quiet for him specifically, before he answers. And then, almost predictably, once he finishes speaking honestly, his body immediately resumes movement, feet tapping, hands gesturing, like physically shaking off the emotional weight the moment verbal vulnerability concludes. This still then move pattern is essentially the inverse of what we saw with V, where Taehyung freezes to process before responding. J-Hope freezes only during the vulnerable admission itself, then uses immediate physical release afterward to process and move past it. There's also his facial micro-expressions during dance breaks and interviews. Genuine, unguarded delight, eyes crinkling completely, mouth open in an unrestrained grin that looks nothing like his more composed press conference smile, because dance accesses a part of his emotional processing that bypasses whatever social filter typically manages his public expressions. Consider also how consistently J-Hope has been documented lifting group morale during grueling schedules. Members and staff alike have mentioned in various interviews how he instinctively starts dancing or joking the moment he senses collective energy dropping during long practice sessions, essentially using his own body as a tool to physically shift the emotional atmosphere of an entire room, similar to Jin's laughter, but expressed through kinetic energy instead of comedic timing. Then there's a specific tell true Army veterans recognize instantly. Watch his hands during genuine excitement, particularly discussing something he's personally passionate about, like production or choreography he created himself. His fingers spread wide, hands move in bigger, freer arcs than during any other type of conversation, an unmistakable physical signature of authentic enthusiasm versus polite, performed interest. Combine the constant micro-movement, the still then release pattern during vulnerability, the unguarded facial delight during dance, and the expansive hand gestures during genuine passion, and you get a complete physiological portrait of someone whose entire emotional world lives primarily in motion rather than words. Someone who found in dance not just a career, but literally a language for feelings he might otherwise never have found a way to express, especially given his documented struggles with anxiety and self-doubt that make verbal vulnerability significantly harder for him than physical release. It's genuinely moving once you understand it, isn't it? Because underneath the label sunshine and hope, there's someone who essentially built an entire coping mechanism out of movement, turning what could have been anxious, restless energy into one of the most beloved and infectious performance styles in the entire industry. So next time you watch J-Hope dance spontaneously in the middle of an unrelated interview, don't just enjoy the entertainment. Recognize that you're watching someone speak his most authentic emotional truth, using a language that doesn't require a single word. Because ARMY, number 2 revealed joy as a physical liberation, and number 1 is about to show you the quietest, most guarded body language of them all, belonging to the member who reveals the absolute least, and exactly why that silence might be the loudest confession on this entire list.
Number 1. Suga, the stillness that says everything. Yoongi's silence as the loudest truth. And here we are, ARMY, a final reveal. And honestly, this one might be the hardest to decode of them all, because Suga's body language isn't built on obvious tells like fidgeting hands or restless feet. It's built almost entirely on absence, on what he doesn't do, making him simultaneously the most guarded and, once you learn to read him, the most quietly revealing member on this entire list. Watch any group interview and notice where Suga positions himself, almost always slightly angled, rarely dead center facing the camera directly, often leaning back rather than forward, physically creating a small buffer of distance between himself and lens, even while technically present in the shot. Casual fans read this as effortless cool, the genius lazy persona he's cultivated since debut, but body language analysts recognize this consistent angled positioning as a subtle self-protective boundary, something people create unconsciously when they want to participate without fully exposing themselves to direct scrutiny. And here's what makes Suga's case so layered. He's been remarkably open, more than almost any other member, about genuinely difficult topics in his own music and interviews, discussing his struggle with panic disorder, his social anxiety, the shoulder injury from a delivery job accident before debut that still affects him, even suicidal thoughts he processed through his solo work as AGD. That kind of verbal openness seems to contradict guarded body language until you realize these are two entirely different channels. Suga processes trauma and difficulty through carefully crafted lyrics and music, a controlled artistic medium where he chooses every word deliberately during production, but his unscripted, real-time physical presence remains defensively minimal precisely because spontaneous exposure feels fundamentally different from curated expression. Watch his hands specifically. Unlike Jungkook's mouth covering or Jimin's hair touching, Suga's hands mostly just rest, folded, still, often tucked into sleeves or resting flat on his knees, rarely gesturing expansively even while speaking passionately about music he's genuinely excited about. This minimal gesture pattern is frequently observed in people managing chronic anxiety, where conserving physical energy and limiting movement becomes an unconscious method of maintaining internal control during external exposure. Then there's his face during group content specifically. Watch him during Run BTS or variety segments, and you'll notice his default expression sits somewhere between mild amusement and complete neutrality, rarely swinging to extremes in either direction, a controlled emotional register that rarely gives away exactly how he's feeling in the moment. This measured neutrality isn't emotional absence. Suga has openly discussed feeling emotions intensely, particularly around themes of mental health and the pressure of fame. It's emotional conservation, a learned skill for someone who has stated directly in interviews and lyrics that he needed distance and privacy to survive an industry that demands total visibility.
Here's the detail that genuinely surprises people once pointed out. Watch specifically what happens when a member says something in an interview that Suga finds genuinely funny or touching. There's a delay, almost always, between the moment something lands emotionally and when his face actually shows it. A half-second lag longer than any other member on this list. Like his expression needs deliberate permission before displaying reaction publicly. This delayed response pattern is strongly associated with people who've developed heightened self-monitoring due to anxiety, essentially running an internal check before allowing any visible emotional display, a habit built from years of needing to protect himself first before performing anything for public consumption. Consider his health history, too. Suga has been candid about his shoulder surgery, about chronic pain that affects how he moves and performs, meaning some of his apparent physical restraint isn't purely psychological, but also genuinely physical, his body literally protecting an old injury through careful, minimal movement, adding another layer of authentic physical caution beneath what looks like simple, cool detachment. And then there's his eyes, perhaps the most telling detail of all. Unlike RM's deliberately maintained eye contact used to project control, Suga's eye contact comes in short, deliberate bursts, direct and intense for a few seconds during genuinely important statements, then breaking away completely, retreating to somewhere neutral, almost like his rationing his own visibility, giving just enough authentic connection before pulling back to protect the rest of himself from exposure. Combined the angled positioning, the minimal hand movement, the controlled neutral expression, the delayed emotional reveal, and the rationed eye contact, and you get a complete portrait of someone who has built an entire physical language around careful, deliberate self-preservation. Someone whose greatest act of vulnerability isn't dramatic emotional display, but the rare, controlled moments where he allows even a sliver of himself through at all. It's honestly the most quietly devastating pattern on this entire list, isn't it? Because Suga has given ARMY some of the most brutally honest lyrics in the group's entire discography, laying bare depression, anxiety, and pain with startling directness through his art, while his actual physical body remains the most protected, the most rationed presence among all 7 members. That contradiction isn't hypocrisy, it's survival architecture, built by someone who learned that complete, unscripted exposure felt unsafe, so he built a controlled artistic channel instead, where he could process and share his truth entirely on his own terms. So next time you watch Suga in an interview, don't wait for big gestures. Watch for the pause before his smile, the brief flash of real eye contact before it retreats. Because ARMY, that fraction of a second is Suga handing you something incredibly rare, a controlled glimpse into a mind that processes everything but reveals almost nothing by accident. And there you have it, 7 members, 7 completely different silent languages, each one a decade-long diary written not in words, but in shoulders, hands, eyes, and the spaces between movements. The question now is simple, ARMY. Now that you know what to look for, are you ready to re-watch everything you thought you already understood?